I'm going to have our colleague Tom Copeland introduce our first speaker, but Tom runs the School of Politics here at Colorado Christian University. I'll give him a quick moment to introduce himself. Great.
Right, so I'm Dr. Tom Copeland. I work for Jeff as Director of Research for the Centennial Institute, where I work with our various part-time policy fellows and faculty fellows, write op-ed pieces and so on, and really trying to help Centennial move forward on the research side with white papers and staying on top of the issues. I also serve not as head, but as a professor in the politics department, training up the next generation of statesmen and women. And I'm so proud of what our students are doing. We have students who have gone on, 2 of them have gone for White House internships, including Jamie Urquhart, who's outside, you may have met. We have students working for top 5 law firms. They've worked in the White House, the previous inhabitant anyway. And the last 2 years, we've had more than a dozen students each semester or each spring working in the Colorado State Legislature as interns and aides. And so I actually kind of joked with Hugh McKean, who's the House Minority Leader, that CCU has figured out the right way to take over a Capitol building. And that's by sending in our interns, right? Having them make a big difference. So I'm excited to be part of what we're doing today. Well, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Paul Larkin. He is the John, Barbara, and Victoria Romo Senior Legal Research Fellow in the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation, where he works on criminal justice policy, drug policy, and regulatory policy. Before joining Heritage in September 2011, he held various positions within the federal government in DC at the Department of Justice, where he was an assistant to the Solicitor General. He's argued 27 cases before the Supreme Court. He also served in the Organized Crime and Racketeering section, did legal work with the EPA, the Department of Defense, and more. He also received his law degree from Stanford Law School, and we're really excited to have Paul come and talk to us today on 21st century illicit drugs and their discontents. Welcome, Paul.
Before anything else, I want to say a few words of thanks. I want to say thanks to the university for giving me the opportunity to speak. I want to say thanks to the people who arranged the event for giving me the opportunity to bat leadoff. As a lifetime New York Yankees fan, to have the same position in the lineup that Aaron Judge has is truly an honor. But mostly, I want to thank you, the people who are here. You have many things that you can do in your life and many ways you can spend these hours. The fact that you are devoting these hours on this day at this place to these problems says a great deal about your interest in them, your willingness to commit your time and resources to address them, and your character, because it shows that you are a person who cares about the interests and lives of others. And that is doing God's work, no matter how you put it. So thank you all, everyone involved in this event and everyone here. Let me start out, however, by just adding to something that we heard from Jeff. Jeff just talked about how in a week or so you're going to have to be considering how you want to vote on psychedelic mushrooms. I haven't been keeping up with this debate here in Colorado on psychedelic mushrooms, but I have a pretty good reason to believe that there's one aspect of this debate that you haven't probably heard much about, and that is this. You know, you take any type of psychedelic substance and it is going to affect you for 6 to 8 hours. And all of these people who are proposing this are saying this is going to be good to deal with PTSD, the other trouble in life, and everything else. And the odds are that they're not going to talk about the number of people who, after an hour or two, decide to get in a car, drive somewhere, and then create a crash that maims or kills other people. Now, why do I say that? Because there are articles in the Journal of the American Medical Association that have endorsed the use of psychedelic drugs to deal with PTSD and other problems. And these are written by people with MDs and PhDs, so we're not talking about picking up some homeless person off the street and asking them for their opinion on this subject. We're talking about people who are highly educated and who, in theory, are very concerned about the interests of their fellow men and women. But the mere fact that they ignored the whole problem of drug-impaired driving tells you a lot about what's going on here. Now, I know I don't have to lecture on drug-impaired driving to people who live in Colorado, because you see it and you hear about it. And if you want the data, I recommend you go to the Rocky Mountain High Intensity Drug Trafficking Task Force website and look at their reports. The last time I read one of their reports, it seemed that there was at least every 4 days a fatality associated with someone who had been driving who then later tested positive for having THC in the system. So it's a real problem here for real victims. And keep that in mind, because a lot of the people, when they debate these issues, like Jeff said, want to talk about it at the 30,000 foot level and say it's all strawberries and cream. And you know what? It ain't. Okay? It has real life effects on real life people who, in the blink of an eye, going from being a real life person to a real life dead person. So think about that. Now, I am in the process of writing a series of articles for the Heritage Foundation on drug policy. It's one of the areas that I work on. And I entitled it 21st Century Illicit Drugs and Their Discontents. And part of the problem with the drugs in the 21st century, ironically, is that science has made them far more dangerous than the drugs that we had witnessed for most of our history. We have known for quite some time that a variety of different drugs, like morphine, have positive and negative outcomes. I mean, the term opioid comes from the Greek opion, which means juice of the poppy. When morphine was created, and then later when the hypodermic needle was invented around the time of our Civil War, morphine became an invaluable use as an analgesic. The problem was, however, it also became a problem for people who overused it. After all, the addiction that a lot of Civil War era soldiers suffered was called the soldier's disease, because they had become addicted to the opioids that were being used for their treatment. And keep in mind, the medical treatment we have for our soldiers today is so far superior to the ghastly types of treatments that were available back 150 years ago, that morphine was probably seen as being the only way to alleviate the awesome suffering that people were having. But then, to try to improve on that, the Bayer company developed acetylmorphine, which they called heroin after the German term heroisch, meaning mighty or strong. Heroin is 5 times as powerful as morphine and more addictive than morphine. And the federal government has put it in Schedule 1 of the drugs listed under the Controlled Substances Act. But unfortunately, it hasn't stopped there. The problem, as Jeff mentioned, today is not really heroin as much as it is fentanyl. Fentanyl is the black mamba of contemporary drugs. It kills in a blink of an eye and does it on a large-scale basis. It is not the product of the opium plant. It is the product of precursor chemicals that is manufactured in a laboratory. And here is the point I'm making about science. Science has been very helpful in a great many ways. But unfortunately, in the 21st century, science has also proved to be extremely dangerous if it is misdirected. I mean, we now have a variety of different vaccines that allow us at least to avoid fatalities, they tell us, from COVID. That's valuable. There are drugs out there that also can treat people who have the disease. But with the good also sometimes comes the risk of the bad, and fentanyl is a good example of that. It was created and used for surgery and for end-of-life pain, where it was applied basically in a patch. But people, being inventive, figured out a way to extricate the drug from the patch and start using it. And then it became known in the United States late in the 70s as China White. It then died off for a long time, but it's back with a vengeance. The initial problem was it came to the United States in final form from China. China has a $1 trillion chemical and pharmaceutical industry that it is incapable of regulating, probably even if it wanted to, because the Chinese Communist Party likes the fact it provides so many jobs to people in different districts throughout a very large nation. It contributes an enormous amount of money to the economy, and it has connections into the political parties that, as we know anywhere, make it very difficult for the average person to persuade elected officials to do something that is beneficial for the society as a whole, but is very damaging to the concentrated people on whom the regulation needs to fall. So we have this circumstance where China for a long time was sending us the completed fentanyl. Now during the Trump administration they changed that. They agreed to schedule all the different fentanyl analogs, and there are many of them. Fentanyl is 50 to 100 times as powerful as morphine. Carfentanil, which is an elephant tranquilizer, is 10,000 times as powerful as morphine. A few grains, not ounces, not grams, grains of fentanyl, okay, can kill. Next time you're out at dinner and you get a nice dark table like you have here, spill out a little salt and just separate out, 3 grains. That's all it takes. And it kills instantly. When the police or EMT show up and they see somebody with a needle still in his or her arm, they know it was fentanyl. The numbers are shocking. Since 2000, 1 million U.S. citizens have overdosed and died, and more than half of that in the last 7 years. 100,000 between June of 2020 and June of 2020 and the end of May of 2021 died from fentanyl. We have this terrible problem that science has created something that can readily be abused and has been abused. More recently, the problem has not been China, it's been Mexico. China is still responsible because it's sending the precursor chemicals to Mexico. But the Mexican cartels, 2 in particular, are building massive production facilities and turning out enormous numbers of pills, as well as an enormous amount of the powdered version of fentanyl, and it's making its way across our southwest border into the United States, in part because the president has refused to stop it. So the problem with fentanyl is a problem of science, but it's more, and I will get to more later on. The second drug that's a major concern is methamphetamine, colloquially known as meth. Originally a product of the work of biker gangs, it is now also being manufactured in large quantities in Mexico. And the problem is, according to Sam Quinones, an author who has studied this drug, there is now an entirely different production method for the creation of methamphetamine. one that leaves an enormous quantity of impurities, toxins, poisons in the ultimate product. The result is people who start using meth wind up either like the ghosts in the Buddhist afterlife who have an insatiable appetite, or the horrific creatures that we see wandering around the world in a post-apocalyptic world. And those of you who are fans of TV shows to that effect, you know exactly what these things can look like. Think also, I think it was Jeff that said, the tents. Well, you know what's happening in those tents? It's not as if they're playing bridge. In those tents, people are not only using illicit drugs, they are selling their bodies to get money to buy the illicit drugs, and it's all out of public view. It's ironic, it's happening out in the public in the sense that these tents are everywhere, and that's what's happening to people inside. But it is out of public view because of, the opaque nature of the covering for the tent. But it isn't, what people are doing is not something that we think is an exercise in freedom of choice. As my colleague Timothy said, these people are not free. They are in the grip of an addiction. And there is a difference between an addiction, by the way, and physical dependence. And it is an important one to keep in mind. Physical dependence means that if you discontinue use of the drug, you will go into withdrawal. If you discontinue use of an opioid, you will have all sorts of rather unpleasant side effects, because there are only so many ways the body can tell you that something is wrong, and they will all happen. Addiction is worse. Addiction is physical withdrawal pains, atop the fact that your entire life is now focused on getting that drug, and it becomes the single most important thing in your life. Now, the Millsian argument that people should be allowed to engage in whatever free choice they make, and they should not be interfered with, certainly by the government when they do this, does not take into account the fact that drug use like this can hardwire the brain in ways we had no idea of, and John Stuart Mill had no idea of when he wrote this back in the 19th century. And by the way, in that regard, it is particularly bad if you start doing this as a juvenile, because juveniles have a very labile brain. You're born with a number of neurons, and they're going to be the ones that you have, but the connections they make start out when you are an adolescent. And if you get connections made to hardwire your entire brain into the pleasure centers, and the pleasure centers as activated by certain drugs, there is a terrible risk that that is now going to take over your life. I mean, when I gave my children the drug lecture, okay, which I'm sure all of you who are parents did at some point, I didn't focus on how drugs are bad for you. I said, yes, there are downsides to it. You can take too much of some drugs and you're going to pass out, or you could even die. I gave them the problem is drugs are too damn good for you. They give you this euphoric feeling that you've never had before, and make you want to have that again and again and again, endlessly. And now you are not in control of your life. It's this drug that is controlling your life. And that's what's happening when people get their brains hardwired for meth or other drugs. But there again, the problem is to some extent science. We have a new way of manufacturing or cooking meth, but it is leaving people far, far worse off than the meth that was being cooked 20, 30 years ago. Finally, let's get to the one everybody knows about and everybody wants to talk about. Cannabis. You probably know it is the subject of numerous debates not just in Colorado, but in a lot of other states, although Colorado certainly was a leader, if you want to use that term. Put scare quotes around it or not, that's your call. In the movement to legalize cannabis. It's very funny. Jonathan Stewart said right after Colorado legalized cannabis, Colorado went from being one of the healthiest states in the nation to one of the sickest states in the nation, because all of a sudden everybody needed medical cannabis for something, even if it was just having a blue day or something like that. The entire debate, and this is not just my view, this is the view of a lot of other people, about the use of medical cannabis, for example, is just riven with fraud. I mean, what you have is essentially people saying, this is good for you. It can cure diseases, as I think Jeff said. That's not true. It can solve all these other problems. Yeah, maybe for a very short period of time, it can make you, ignorant of them, the same way drinking wild turkey does. But it certainly doesn't solve them. And nobody thinks of wild turkey as a great drug to use. We have, unfortunately, been taken in by people who have been trying to make money, and they got at the good nature of a lot of Americans and Coloradans by saying this is going to relieve end-term cancer, multiple sclerosis, epilepsy, and the like. Well, it just hasn't worked out that way. And what's happened is essentially it has become a drug of use for the purely recreational purpose that the people behind medical marijuana had in mind all along. Now, does that mean the pre-Colorado 2012 regulatory regime or the pre-1996 California medical marijuana regulatory regime was the right one? No. The problem with the regulation of cannabis has been Congress followed the wrong approach for more than 8 decades and hasn't been willing to step up to the plate and admit it made a mistake and readdress this problem. Let me give you a little history on this. It wasn't until early in the 20th century the states started to criminalize the use of cannabis. And it wasn't until 1937 when Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act that Congress finally got into the business of it. Now, technically, all the Marijuana Tax Act did was require that you register with the federal government that you wanted to sell it and then pay a tax to get your license, a stamp. Problem was all 50 states by then prohibited the possession and sale of cannabis. So if you applied to the Treasury Department for a license to sell it, you were essentially just opening yourself up to criminal prosecution. And so in 1969, the Supreme Court held that that was unconstitutional. And the following year, for other reasons as well, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act when they put cannabis in Schedule 1. The problem was, in between, in 1938, Congress passed the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which created the Office of the Commissioner of Food and Drugs and the Food and Drug Administration, and directed the Commissioner of Food and Drugs to decide what is a drug and whether that drug is safe and effective, and only if it is it allowed to be distributed in interstate commerce. The mistake Congress made was not at that same time transferring all authority over cannabis, because people knew it was a drug, to the Food and Drug Administration. Let them decide. Because gall might have been divided into 3 parts, but cannabis has only 2. Medical use and recreational use. That's it. And that's been the case since 1938. And in fact, in 2009, under the Obama administration, Congress passed the Family Protection and Smoking Reduction Act, which then also federalized the regulation of tobacco, burnt tobacco products. My point is, for a very long time, society has made the choice that when it comes to drugs, whether something is a drug and whether these drugs are safe and effective, we have entrusted the Food and Drug Administration with the responsibility to make these decisions. And we do not make those decisions by plebiscite. We don't allow states to opt out of the federal anti-discrimination laws, the federal tax code, the environmental laws, okay, the labor laws, whatever. We don't allow people to vote on which of those particular laws they don't like and therefore they don't have to comply with. We have made the judgment as a society that this is not actually a matter for a federalist system to address. It's one that needs to be addressed as a scientific matter by people who are most skilled in making these judgments, and the people at the Food and Drug Administration have that responsibility. And I represented them when I was at the Justice Department. You heard that I worked at the Justice Department. And the people at the FDA are there because they see protecting the public health as a mission, as a valuable mission, and as one that it's worth devoting their time to and lives to, because they can make a lot more money working in the pharmaceutical industry. Trust me about this. But they're there to protect public health. They care about this. And we have made that judgment. And the whole problem of recreational use of cannabis avoids the fact that the reason it gives you that recreational use euphoria is because the drug contains substances like THC that are themselves drugs. They have an effect on the body and therefore fit within the definition in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of what's a drug. But Congress has been unwilling to rectify this problem since then. Basically, Congress has taken the same position as Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane when he said, "Let this cup pass from me. I don't want to deal with it." Why? Because it's a hot button issue. No matter how you cast your ballot, you are going to anger somebody. Okay? And the single most important thing an elected official wants is to be reelected. So the last thing they want to do is make people angry. They may not always be able to satisfy people, but you make people angry, you're at risk of losing their vote. So what does that mean now going forward? Well, as I said, science has good and bad sides to all of this. The good side is some of the constituents in these drugs, like the constituents in cannabis, can have legitimate, valuable therapeutic effects, and we need to investigate that. But we need to investigate it as a scientific matter, because we're talking about legitimate uses of something that can't be used by itself. There's no physician worth his or her salt that'll tell you when they give you a prescription for a drug, use as much or as little of it as you want, as often or as infrequently as you want, whatever. Okay? That's what happens when a physician recommends that you go out and smoke a joint. Okay? There's no uniform number of inhalations, no uniform depth of any one inhalation, no uniform length that someone holds in inhalation. And that puts aside the fact that there are numerous impurities in the drug, there's no consistency in the potency, and that in turn depends also on what you're talking about. I mean, the joints that Grandpa and Grandma smoked at Woodstock were like 1 to 3% THC. Now, the botanical form is, somewhere between sometimes 12 and 18 or 20%. Hash or hash oil can be up in the 40s. And if you're talking about the distilled product known as shatter, you can get 90+% THC. That is not the same drug that everybody talked about and that is portrayed in stoner films. It is a very, very different drug. And we know that 10% of the people who start out early on using cannabis on a long-term basis will develop some sort of physical dependence or addiction. And 10% of the people who are in the same boat, start out early, use it on a heavy basis, will develop potentially psychotic symptoms to it. Now, we don't know if it's 10% or 20% because we don't know how much overlap there is. But we have to ask ourselves, what percentage of the population are we willing to accept to have these very serious problems before we step in and stop it? Science tells us that we need to be careful about allowing people to use a drug that is going to cause them harms. And the cannabis that is out there today is a lot different than the cannabis when Crosby, Stills, and Nash first played in upstate New York. Okay? Now, the good side of science is we know that. And maybe we can find some good uses for this, for the cannabinoids. The FDA has approved some of them. And maybe they will approve more. And maybe what they'll do is that'll encourage people to develop pills that can be used, because then they can be manufactured with the same requirements that normal pharmaceuticals are. Or it can be manufactured in inhalants, like Narcan is, that you give to people who suffered an opioid overdose. Because that is the way medicine is administered. It's not by, smoking a doobie. So, science can lead us in the right direction there. And maybe science can help us in another way. One of the downsides of the widespread use of cannabis is an increase in the number of people who are one toke over the line and get behind the wheel of an automobile. We don't have yet a good way of measuring what quantity of THC in the blood creates that problem. And maybe science will come up with that, and that will help us deal with this problem. Maybe not, because it may be difficult to find what that quantity is, but we also need a device for measuring whatever we find out that quantity to be. My last point. Jeff said we have all these different problems, and we have to try to address them. I think one problem that we have is not scientific, it's not medical, it's more social, and that's this. For the last 60 years, the intelligentsia, the media, the academies have told us that self-fulfillment, self-advancement, self-satisfaction is the ne plus ultra in life, and that self-sacrifice is for chumps. And we've heard that repeated so often that it has become part of the DNA of a lot of people today. The tragedy is, if people don't spend the money on this product and buy it, they won't suffer the problems, and other third parties won't suffer them either. But we have lost the notion as a society that we need to make sacrifices for a greater good. And we belittle the people who are willing to do that. You know that the military can't meet its enlistment quotas anymore, which is terribly problematic if you're relying on a volunteer military. Well, guess what? Most of the people who are willing to volunteer, as shown by history, have been said recently they're all racists, or they're whatever. They are not worthy of our support as Americans. You tell them that, and they're not going to be willing to volunteer to put their life at risk for other people. You tell people that making a sacrifice for the greater good isn't a worthwhile undertaking. It's a character defect. And people aren't going to do it. What we need to help with this problem is persuade Americans to go back to the